Back to the medieval times. Got to the Song Dynasty last time, and I mentioned the Song Dynasty was a socialistic dynasty, true, and they did not keep their army strong. They lost Tibet. Now, here's the twist of irony. The Chinese invented gunpowder. And yet, when it came to an actual war, the Mongolians used the gunpowder against them. They did not use what we might call guns, but what we might call hand grenades, crude though they were, but they were flamethrowers of a sort, but they could be thrown into the Chinese army by the Mongolians and get the Chinese armies to run. And it was a shame because the Chinese should have been using it against the Mongolians. Instead, they taught the Mongolians how to use gunpowder. And the very weapons that the Chinese had invented were used against the inventors. It would be an ironic twist of fate if Westerners would find we're being defeated in battle by the very weapons that we ourselves made. It has happened in history before, folk, where that the enemy uses your own weapons against you, and this is a classic case. Anyway, once they overthrew the Song dynasty, they established the Yuan dynasty or the Mongol dynasty. Now, just keep this in mind because I'm going to get to Chinese religious and philosophical history before I come back to their political history. But this Mongol dynasty was to govern China for a few hundred years, and then like the other dynasties they fell by the wayside. But basically China was ruled by foreigners. Fortunately, the foreigners allowed the Chinese to keep their religion and their traditions, so China remained intact under the rule of foreigners. Alright, but backing up a little bit, now leaving the political history, the Song dynasty reinstated the civil service exam. The civil service exam had fallen out of favor during the days of the Tang dynasty. If you remember, the Tang dynasty preceded the Song. But as the Song dynasty brought it back, in part to try to take control. Now, I believe I've mentioned this class how that these old rulers had to govern through nobility. In the 20th century, Adolf Hitler and Stalin and Lenin could govern by means of telephone and truck and railroad and radio. These people had none of that. So they would have to pick noblemen and assign a nobleman, you go to this district, and another nobleman, you go to that district, and govern through the nobility. But the Song dynasty found a way to pick and choose their nobility by saying simply you get a government position if you can get a high score on an exam. Now, I had a pupil ask me one time, how do you know that a person who can score well on an exam would make a good government official? The answer is, by what method do you choose a government official? There's two methods. One is merit and the other is hereditary. I mean, if your father were a general, you'd become a general, and it's found that doesn't always work. And some people who can get really, really high test scores do not work out when it comes to the practical side of things. And more than one Chinese scholar could, you might say, ace the civil service exam, but could not govern very well, so they sometimes give these scholars positions as professors at the university. If you call them universities, they didn't quite call them that then, but now, I want to elaborate more on these exams. They were not really fair in that there were no public schools, so the very, very poor had no chance. The very, very poor had no chance to pass them. Only persons who were literate, because the exams were written. Now, there was another side to them. It's known that there was cheating on the exams, and this is something that try as we might, I mean, you all of you, I think, know I try really, really hard to make it very difficult to cheat in my classes. But I did have a case of it a couple of semesters back. In fact, you're about to see the same test that I used to catch them. I made up 3 different tests. Caught a fella red-handed. His neighbors were not taking the same test that he was. And I said to the class, now, if you made above 50 points, don't worry, I don't think you're a cheat. But if you made down in the 20s, and one of them had, guess what? I'm certain you're a cheat. I'm just going to give you a low grade and let it ride this time, but know this, I know who you are. Anyway, but now, there was some cheating. Now, folks, all right, what I'm about to say, and again, you can call my hand on if you want to, and there was a fellow who sat in my class, back around 2004, somewhere in that time period, who went and reported me to my boss, the department head, for saying this. My department head wrote me a letter. I said he could have said it in class. I told her my pupils could say what they want to, and I said I had a Vietnamese communist in my class one time, and he even laughed when I reminded the class that the United States had lost the Vietnam War. So he got an A in my class. He certainly was not me. I mean, the reason I call him Vietnamese, of course, because he was from Vietnam, and I call him a communist because that's what he told me he was. So I'm not slandering the fella. He was a Vietnamese communist, pure and simple. He got an A in my class. Anyway, what this fellow told on me was for saying what I'm about to say. In our country, our test, I'm talking about the national teacher exam and the graduate record exam, appear to me, a lot of people, to be slanted towards the left. Leftism and liberalism. And I'm not talking about some of the tests you take here at this school. I'm talking about national test, national government test, and I was advised pick the most liberal answer that's on the choice. It's their multiple choice test, and usually that's the answer they want. And that's somebody else they went and told on me. Okay. You can tell them if you want to. It just appears to me that this is the way that our national test went up. Well, now, what's this have to do with the Chinese civil service exams are heavily slanted towards Confucianism. Very heavily slanted. And in fact, you had to be able to memorize large portions of Confucius' writings and write them down on the test. And a lot of the tests, they were not multiple choice such as we have. They were short answer or essay type tests. And you had to be able to write an essay and quote large portions of Confucianism in order to pass the test. The idea was to keep Taoists and Buddhists out of government positions and only appoint Confucianists to the high positions. Now, there's something else that you might not realize until you do a lot more reading on it, but a lot of persons have said that the Chinese emphasis on getting high test scores to get in a government position was one of the things that held the Chinese back. Now, all right, in 21st century America, we take for granted if you don't want to work for the government, you can still make it as a musician, as an artist, as an actor, and get high up in society, or you can become a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, a college teacher, an engineer. But in those days, among the Chinese young men, the only way to advance was to get a government position. And this was done at the expense of, perhaps, engineering, the expense of merchants, businessmen. None of this seemed to matter to the Chinese. It was just get a government position. And there's a lot of people say this was what held China back and kept China from advancing and developing the way the Chinese should have. I mean, the way the Chinese started off, if they'd have kept going, they could have been to the moon long ago, and like I said the other day, perhaps I'd be teaching this class on Mars instead of here on Earth. But that didn't happen. Instead, the Chinese fell by the wayside. I mean, they started out, they were going places, and they made a lot of inventions, but their inventions did not carry them, including gunpowder, which wound up being used by their enemies against them. But all that the young men thought about doing was getting in government position, getting high up in the government, and that was the only way they could get ahead. They should have taken advice from Donald Trump, make a reputation as a businessman and then go from business to the presidency. By the way, I want to tell you something that you might not have heard. Our founding fathers had that in mind. They didn't picture a class of professional politicians who would do nothing for a living but run for politics. They wanted men and I say men, I mean, I know, but I say men, but the women who've been successful in the real world go and serve in Congress for maybe 2 to 6 years, then come home and go back to their business. Or men who have been successful in whatever they've been at, whether it be general in the Army or whatever, serve as president or serve as Congress, serve as senator for a while, but they did not want professional politicians. Instead, our country has been run mostly during my lifetime by professional politicians. Take that for what you will, and anyway, civil service exam, again, only the nobility had much of a chance to pass it. It has also been said that the Song dynasty used it to gain control. They would fudge, if they had a person take the exam whom they liked. The exam was, all right, what you call a subjective test. Now, I want to say this about subjective test. When I was in undergrad school, most of the tests I took were what you call objective. You get the right answers counted right. I'm still not about to say tongue-in-cheek. A subjective test, the teacher has a lot of leeway about giving you any grade that teacher chooses to grade. And you've got the feeling sometimes the teachers were showing favoritism towards certain pupils, which is why I almost hate, but when I went to, I was called the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, I took history. We often wondered if the teachers were not showing favoritism towards certain pupils whom they liked. Because a subjective test, the teacher has a lot of leeway to put any grade the teacher wants on your test score. Now, again, any of you have any comments about that? I mean, the thing about a true-false test or a multiple choice test, the answers are done by machine, the grading done by machine. Yes.
Well, that's just like when we have to turn in a written paper.
Yeah.
There's a lot of subjectivity when you're grading that.
Mostly I avoid it by emphasizing grammar and syntax more than content, because now you get higher up.
If the content's better.
Well, I mean,
I understand.
you get past the bachelor's, you get into graduate school, you sign up for history class, and a lot of times the time to me is TBA, the location is TBA. You just go into your teacher and say, okay, I signed up for your class, and the teacher assigns you a 30-page paper. And occasionally you go back and report what you've done, and then at the end of the semester you turn in the paper and that's your grade. You're doing the professor's research for him. And one of you knows what I'm saying, a couple of you might know what I'm saying, to be the truth.
Yep.
And again, the teacher does have a whole lot of discretion determining where your grade. Now, if you're getting, of course, now, you're comparing the paper that I assigned, but I try to make sure that the grading is not as subjective. And students who
I'm not
really don't
accusing
like-
you of that, but
Yeah.
my point is that
Yeah.
when someone turns in a paper, you
Yeah,
have
okay, that's true.
your kind of parameters. It's based on what you're looking for, which makes it subjective.
Yeah. And I wanted to say this too about the paper. There was some research done when I was still in school 50 years ago, where a student turned in the same paper from 7th grade to graduate, word for word, even with the same typos, the same mistakes, the same bad grammar, word for word, to 7 or 8 different teachers, and his grade on that same paper ranged from an A to a D. This actually happened, and the word got around. I don't know if you ever heard that story or
No.
not, but we were told it. The grades. Actually, I was still in high school when it happened. Our high school social studies teacher told us. So again, this was a problem with this civil service exam. It was subjective, and the examined grader could put just about any grade the examined grader wanted to put on it. Again, it was designed in part to give the emperors more control over who they picked as government officials. A lot of your modern day scholars say, oh, it was an advanced way of making sure that only qualified persons got the job, because a lot of times the oldest son or even another younger son of a government official might not make a good government official. But nevertheless, And your book does state that the Chinese had more equality in qualifying for government positions than did other countries. And European nations did not have this thing until the 1700s, when European nations started copying the Chinese and giving civil service exams. Now, we do have a civil service exam in our country, and if you've served in the Army or served in the military, you get 5 points boosted on your grade right up front. So at least it did when I was younger. I don't know if that's still true or not. But you can get a civil service job if you have a good test score on your civil, again, provided there's an opening. That's the catch-22, is there an opening? Now, the center of Chinese life for most people is the village. The Chinese village were usually allowed to govern themselves. Basically, the Chinese village consists of a few houses. Mostly the people who lived in them were related to each other. And then there's the houses were surrounded by farmland. And most of the farming was rice. Rice and maybe a few other things, but and it took the whole village to farm the rice crop. And most of what little experience the Chinese men and women ever got through the government was through the village. And most of them never rose any higher than the local village. China remained agricultural. Now, in some ways, we were just talking before class, how that we in this country need farmers. But the Chinese, your book wishes that they would have gotten some of their people off the farms into factories, and they developed more factories. The Chinese looked down on merchants, and again, this was to be part of their undoing. And by looking down on merchants, of course, they also did not seem to rate businessmen very highly. Merchants, businessmen, factory owners, factory workers, not very highly. In fact, it wasn't until the communist takeover the Chinese began to at least try to industrialize. And I have to say lately they've industrialized so well that you can't breathe the air. And this I know from the experience that the women in my family have had visiting China. The air is really, really filthy. Now, the Tang Dynasty, as I think I mentioned, I'm going to mention again, your book does. This was the dynasty preceded the Song. The Tang Dynasty, they took land from the rich and redistributed land. And folks, it just seems like, to persons who don't know, that this is a great idea. The rich don't need all the land they have, so take it from them and give it to the poor who do need it. It's just the problem is, show me an instance where it's worked. It's been tried several times throughout history. The Tang Dynasty tried it, and the result was, within a generation, all this land that had been taken from the rich wound up buying it back. And it wound up with a very unequal distribution of land anyway. Now, the Song Dynasty, I call them socialists, they tried to help the poor. Again, folks, hey, helping the poor is a very noble act. One of the most noble things you do, as long as you're doing it voluntarily of your own free will. But when the government does it, it is not noble. And it brings down the governments that do it and keep doing it over and over. The Song Dynasty that came afterwards also tried to help the poor. Here's part of the problem. I mean, this happened during our Great Depression. We had many depressions before the Great. We had a depression in 1819, 1837, 1857, 1877, 1897, you know, every 20 years. Then we had the worst one. Well, we had one in 1921. While Woodrow Wilson was lying flat on his back and out of it, suffering from a stroke. And in all those depressions, we got over them without government assistance. Then came the Depression 1930. Franklin Roosevelt said, I'm going to help you out of it. Okay, let's wait for the president. And the Depression went on and on and on and on. 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936. Then 1937, we had a depression within a depression. And then 1938, but then came World War II. And all of a sudden, the depression, it ended overnight. People woke up one morning and found that factories were trying to steal each other's workers. Said, hey, come to work for me, because the government was their customer and they knew everything that what the government was going to buy. So every factory started stealing each other's workers, trying to produce more. The depression ended abruptly when World War II began in Europe. Now, we were not involved in it first, but anyway, the point I'm trying to make, folk, is when the government starts trying to help the poor people, the government's going to bail me out of this eventually. Folk, now I want to say this. I mean, probably every one of you, within the sound of my voice, if you haven't already, is going to find yourself in a situation where your income is this much, but your obligations are here. I've had it happen to me 3 or 4 times. What do you do? Number one is what you don't do. Don't hope the government is going to bail you out. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Either look for another source of income or get rid of some of the assets, or maybe eat out less, drive less, take fewer vacations. It's a temporary measure. It's a temporary. These things pass if you handle it yourself. But if you're depending on the government to bail you out, oh my, you'll wait a lifetime if you ever get bailed out at all. All right.